So I take with great relief today the fact that I get to take a break from arguing about this Sophie's Choice stuff about which of these monsters to vote for in the general election, and I get to spend a little bit of time today arguing about broader philosophical questions about how to think about capitalism and socialism and freedom and individual rights and all of that good stuff with somebody who I profoundly disagree with, but is a intelligent and thoughtful interlocutor. Make sure you unmute yourself, Antony. So this is Antony Sammeroff. Do you want to just briefly introduce yourself for people who might not be familiar with you?
Hi, Ben. It's a great honor to appear in your new show. Excuse me. Let's get that out of the way. Hello, everyone. Thank you for bearing witness to our second conversation. It's good to be here in the lines then speaking to people who have disagreements with me. I'm a libertarian writer. You can find a lot of my articles, including articles on Marx and Mises.org. I'm the author of a book called Universal Basic Income For and Against, which I've been told is a very even-handed book where I present the arguments in favor of the universal basic income and as well as those against, and also offer some alternatives from a libertarian perspective on ways that I think we could significantly increase living standards for people at the bottom of the economic ladder.
All right, thank you for that, Antony.
I don't think too much about. Sorry, I was just saying I don't think too much about.
Cut off for a second.
Rich
Keep
people.
going.
Did I? I was just saying I don't think too much about rich people. I mostly think about poor people. So,
okay. Well,
yes, we can take
that's as good an entry point as any. So since you have indicated that you are willing to come back for repeat performances after today, so I'm not too worried about what range of subjects that we end up covering. We can keep going in future installments, but what you just said is as good an entry point as any, right? So you say that that you're not primarily, when you make this libertarian critique of statism, of doing government redistribution, that you're not primarily concerned with the welfare of rich people. You're primarily concerned with the welfare of poor people. But I mean, just to start out, right? Like one obvious case in point, right? So I guess when you say you're a libertarian, I take it that you don't just mean like what sometimes like a certain kind of Republican in the United States might say, oh, I have some libertarian leanings or whatever, right? But like you really mean that if there is any legitimate role for the government, and actually I'm not sure if you think there is or not, or if you go all the way to anarcho-capitalism, but if there is a legitimate role for government, it would purely be preventing force and fraud. It's not to be in the business of doing things like providing healthcare and education. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes, that would be fair.
Okay. So for example, right, that means that where you live, there's something called the National Health Service, by virtue of which everybody can get their health care provided for free at publicly owned hospitals, and so I think an obvious response when you say that you're mostly concerned with poor people is, I don't imagine that most people in Scotland would want to trade places with Americans who have to worry, for example, that if they lose their job, they'd lose their health insurance. But I mean, I take it you would want to abolish the NHS. You don't think that's a legitimate government function?
Yeah, I would say ultimately I would abolish the NHS, but I don't think that would be a starting point. The first thing would be to completely deregulate the private provision of healthcare so that the kind of innovations that you would see in the fall in price could then influence the National Health Service and ultimately make it redundant. I mean, we could unpack this topic for hours, Ben, but it's not correct that everyone here has access to healthcare. We've got maybe approaching 5 million on waiting lists, and this is in a country of 70 million people. Uh, Old people are outright refused services. We have lots of rationing. People love the NHS until they're in it. I'm not going to defend the American system. The American government spends more per head on healthcare than the UK government is, and you don't even have a national health service.
Right, which certainly suggests
Um,
to me that that trying to provide subsidies and do things like that, have this patchwork system, is a much less efficient use of money
okay,
because
well,
if in the UK
right.
you have 5 million people on various sorts of waiting lists in a country of 70 million, that means that that 65 million, right? That's about 93% of the population is not in that situation.
Okay, but we're talking
So
about the people with
compare that to the tens of millions of people in the United States, making up a much bigger percentage of the population who don't have any sort of health insurance at all. So if they have something that might be nothing and might be cancer, then they have to think about things like, okay, do I want to go to the doctor? After all, there's a good chance that it's nothing, and I really can't afford to pay for that right now because I would be paying for it out of pocket. And so presumably you don't want that to happen, right? So in your view, what's behind door number 3, right? If you don't like the
Okay,
yeah.
that's a great question. Yeah, okay, so I think it's not fair to say 65 million people do have access to healthcare because we want to look at the people who actually have conditions that might land them on a waiting list. The fact is that
Well, I mean,
regularly,
hold
wait a
on, right?
second, can we do one? Can we do one at a time? Can I just
Okay,
develop my
okay, but
point?
I'm really going to want to go back to that because I think that's a really interesting claim. But keep going.
Sure, I'm happy to do that. Um, So routinely people are seen next day in the USA for things that people are put on a waiting list here. Again, I don't want to defend the United States medical system. That is a crony capitalist system. In many cases, people can't even open a hospital without going to a board and justifying the need for the hospital. And some people on the board will be administrators from the hospital that exist in the same area and what have you. People are banned from buying insurance from states other than their own. There's tons of ways where the government pushes the price of healthcare through the roof in the United States. But what the two systems have in common is third-party payers of some kind, which means that healthcare isn't subject to the discretion of the consumer, where they can say they can get a better healthcare at a better price. They don't have the option of taking their business elsewhere. So that does not create a upward pressure in quality and downward pressure in price as we see in other industries which are largely left to the free market. Um,
So just to clarify the point, right? That you're
so what's behind door number 3? Well, that's
okay. Well, I just want to make sure I understand what you're saying, right? So they have so your objection is that we have insurance in the first place. So there's this third party that's in the picture. I'm sure coffee would cost a lot more if you had coffee insurance and they were building it and
sure.
they were billing
That's
it
one
to a coffee
example.
company, right? All right, I'll buy that, right? But I guess what I get a little confused by, and maybe you're about to say this in door number 3, is how exactly you're going to avoid that, because people can pay for health insurance, healthcare out of pocket right now, right? They don't choose, they don't generally choose to do so if they can possibly help it, because the costs are so exorbitant. And you could say, okay, the costs are only so exorbitant because most people most people, are charging it to insurance rather than paying for it out of pocket. But since presumably you don't want to like ban insurance, right? That would go against libertarian principles. How do we go about getting to a situation where most people are not using health insurance?
Sure. Okay, so people can have insurance for things that are unpredictable and things like that, that's fine. I think that broadly speaking, we don't really have, I think our systems have more in common than they have apart, which is that they're essentially systems of sick care, not healthcare. The only thing that's remunerated within these systems is the treatment of ill health. Everyone gets paid for treating sickness, and you've seen, you know, the excesses of the pharmaceutical industrial complex and what have you. They're protected by patents from the government, which I disagree with. The move towards ensuring everything happens when during the war there was a ban on increasing wages, so um, companies started giving people health insurance and other perks and things like that. And health insurance is not taxed at the same time as other incomes. So employers are incentivized to give people benefits in the form of health insurance when actually they might actually like the money in their pocket to spend on whatever they want, not being overinsured. This is an extremely complicated issue. But I would just say this, if you wanted a halfway house, I think the best thing to do would be for the government, rather than to say subsidize people with Medicare and Medicaid and encourage them to take out insurance, is just to put some money every month in a savings account for people that they could then draw down from when they had some kind of medical emergency or to gain healthcare services. The reason for that is it would at least simulate a market in which there was truly open competition, which would put a downward pressure on price of services and an upward pressure on the quality of services.
One problem with that is that if you have a health savings account, that healthcare costs are so wildly unpredictable, and which means that of course you might have this downward pressure on prices that you're talking about, because if not enough people, right, can afford it at the out-of-pocket price that you're talking about, then fewer people will buy it, and that'll provide an incentive to eventually lower that price. But meanwhile, if you just can't afford your radiation treatments for cancer, you're not going to be getting them, and there's an obvious concern that you have that you could have a situation where enough people can afford it at the higher price bracket, that especially for certain kinds of specialized services, things that are innately more expensive because of the machinery involved, etc. That, like many products, right, it could still be worth it to the providers to sell it at the higher price points for people who can just directly afford it out of pocket, or who, in addition to the health savings account, can afford health insurance that's taxed at a normal rate. Whereas a lot of people end up without something like Medicaid, end up being left out in the cold. I'd also say that all systems, like you talked earlier, right? I just want to make sure this doesn't get lost, right? You talked earlier about people on waiting lists, which I agree is the bitter fruit of decades of Tory and New Labour cuts to the NHS, and stealth undermining and privatizing bits and pieces of it, which is appalling. And of course, there's a vicious cycle, because doing those things to undermine it, right, then leads to shortages that can then be used as an excuse to paint the system in a negative light and thus justify future cuts. But all systems, right, even a really well-funded one, sure, you get some rationing around the edges because all systems have finite resources. The question is, when you run up to the limits of those finite resources and you can't cover everything for everybody, is the rationing done on the basis of money, like it is in the United States, or is it done on the basis of something else? And a relatively fairly administered waiting list strikes me as vastly more just than people who can afford something getting to buy their way to the head of the line.
No, I don't agree with that, because long-term people who can afford to buy things getting to the head of the line are putting money into the system, which then will attract more service providers to that service and bring the price down over the long term so more people get access. But the thing is, when you're speaking, your challenge, when you're saying, oh, you know, some people are not going to afford it if you've got a health savings account, I think that number would be vastly lower than under the current system. Because the prices of services are so, and there's so much fraud, the prices of services are so vastly inflated compared to what they would be in a free market sorry, Ben, let me develop my point because I gave you quite a lot of time.
Okay, but you know,
Okay.
but you're saying something that I
Right.
think it's important that we don't lose. But finish up your point.
That's fine. So the thing is, you're speaking like we can create some there's the resources are always going to be limited
That
so
is my point.
long. There comes a point at when someone's going to say, how much money are you going to pay to save someone 1 year of life? It's morbid as hell, but at some point, the government administrators are going to decide who can live and who can die. And the problem is with our system, people are not aware of that. And at some point, they may have made different decisions during their lifetime. Did they know that at 70 years of age they're going to be denied services outright? And no one here makes provisions for that because they believe that they're covered.
Okay, but yes, of course, that's absolutely true what you just said, right? That I don't know that most people don't know that. I think everybody knows that. I think they make the rational calculation that it's better when you run up against those limits, when those morbid choices have to be made, which of course, a better funded version of the NHS, you'd have to make fewer of them, of course. It's been undermined for decades, but of course, in any system, you'd have to make some of them. The question is, what should be used to decide when that happens?
Yes, I agree. I agree that that decision is to be made.
Do you let people higher up the socioeconomic spectrum buy their way to the head of the line, or do you try to have some relatively even-handed system applying fair, impartial rules to decide how those scarce resources get allocated?
Right, I see the point you're making, but I don't think you're actually taking into account how much cheaper healthcare services would be on a free market. You know, there's the Oklahoma Surgery Center, the surgery center in Oklahoma, which routinely does things over the counter, sometimes for a tenth of the price that other hospitals are claiming insurance for. So I think with on a free market system, yes, you know, you'd have to have charities, you'd have to have cooperatives, in some cases insurance, you'd have charity hospitals, healthcare workers that are volunteering and so forth.
So some
But
people have to go
also,
to a charity hospital if there's one in their area,
yeah,
whereas
yeah,
other
but
people get world-class health
yeah,
care at
yes,
a
they
much better
can. Yeah,
hospital.
yeah, and and I have to bite the bullet and say I'm not necessarily adverse to that. I think those people who go and pay for the class healthcare system, they're shoveling money into the system that is then going to attract more service providers by the law of supply and demand, and that will bring the prices of service down, making them more affordable to ordinary people, just the same way that those who are silly enough to buy the new laptop or the new iPhone as soon as it comes out are basically subsidizing people who wait a couple of years to get it later. It seems inegalitarian at the front end of it, but
Well,
at the tail end of
it literally is inegalitarian.
yeah, no, it is an egalitarian.
As a matter of life and death, some people
On the
have a
long,
better chance
on the
of
long
others
term,
depending on their income.
on the long term, even from a utilitarian perspective, I think it's going to turn out far better results.
So let's think about that prediction, right? That in the long term, it'll turn out better. I would say
For most people.
I would say parenthetically that there are non-utilitarian things or things that aren't directly utilitarian in terms of the most obvious metrics that should be taken into account here, like dignity, right? Should you have to beg on GoFundMe to get life-saving medical care versus should it be your right as a citizen? But as far as the utilitarian calculations, at least as far as the real world options, right? You can speculate about how what you would regard as a really true free market would play out in practice. I can speculate about how I think it would play out in practice, but as far as the data that we have about things that have actually been implemented on a national scale, then the evidence is pretty clear. So people where you are live longer on average, die of treatable diseases less than people where I live. And so you could say, okay, sure, so maybe the NHS performs vastly better by every single metric than the American healthcare system in terms of the purpose, like lowering infant mortality, extending life.
Ben, why are you choosing the American system?
I'm sorry, Antony, you didn't let me cut you off earlier. Okay. So, as far as all of these crucial metrics, the British system performs vastly better than the American system. The Canadian system performs vastly better than the American system, etc. Now, you could say, sure, some hypothetical system might perform even better, right? Just kind of the same way that if we're talking about the failures of Soviet planning, somebody who is an ultra-leftist could say, okay, but that wasn't real communism, and because they still had commodities and Soviet citizens were still paid in rubles, so if they'd gone all the way to real communism, it would have performed way better. And maybe, but if we're going to stay grounded in what's actually played out in the real world, the evidence is overwhelming that socialized systems perform far better than systems with more significant market elements.
Right, okay. First of all, you're poisoning the well and you're cherry picking. It's interesting that you choose America as an example of a capitalist or a free market healthcare system when it's the provisions highly regulated in every single way imaginable. But you don't mention, say, Singapore, which has one of the best.
Singapore is vastly less free market than the United States. Singapore
outcomes in the world, right?
Singapore has Obamacare on steroids.
When it comes to healthcare, right? Then you look at, say, something that like the Netherlands, where they have more of a, they have mandatory insurance, but people can shop around. And I think, well, I mean, as far as I can tell, most of the services in Singapore are paid for over the counter, even if it is with government money. So people are shopping around. In America, you can't. Well, I mean, I never at any point said that I was going to defend the America system.
No, I understand.
But the fact is, almost all of...
But that's not my point. My point is that if you compare countries like Singapore...
America is the single greatest innovator in healthcare.
Okay, so do you think that innovation? Do you think that medical innovation?
But no. What I'm saying is,
of private health insurance.
in countries where we have socialized healthcare, we actually benefit from being able to employ innovations that were made in the private system in America.
That's a very common argument. The reason that I find that very unpersuasive is that if you actually look at medical innovation in the United States, most of it's happening in government labs, especially when we're talking about NMEs, new molecular entities, as opposed to just taking something that's already been developed, quite likely at a government lab by the National Institutes for Health or at some public university, and tweaking it a little bit to patent it. And I would also point out that if we're going to broaden the discussion to the private pharmaceutical industry, that we've all been living since March with the bitter fruits of the decisions of that private pharmaceutical industry, and really the incentives of that private pharmaceutical industry. Because even after MERS and SARS, which were both near misses with respiratory ailments becoming a pandemic on this scale, there was no big push to do research into other respiratory ailments. Why not? Because the short-term profit incentives of the pharmaceutical companies aren't really served by doing things like looking ahead to possible threats that might be coming up in the next few years and thinking like that. They're really incentivized to think in terms of quarterly profit projections. So when the coronavirus happened, by the way, a direct result of deregulation in China, lifting the ban on selling wild meat at wet markets, when the coronavirus happened, we were left out in the cold because of the incentives built in to having the pharmaceutical industry be a for-profit thing.
Okay, well, I mean, I don't know if this is congruent what you're saying in addition to, or the last I heard, the FDA ruled that the CDC was the only company that was allowed to make tests at the beginning of the pandemic, and then the CDC's tests didn't even work. So if they just let the pharmaceuticals make
So, so,
companies make
so
tests, then maybe they would have
as
had
you say,
testing
these
kits
things
sooner.
are
In
completely
addition to that,
valid.
sorry, Ben, can we please go one at a time? As my philosophy professor used to say, one fool at a time.
Well,
Please allow me to
I'm
be the flow.
trying to, but you keep on
And
expressing a thought and then moving on to two or three more thoughts, and I keep wanting to go back to the first thought. But say what you're going to say.
well, I mean, I'm giving you as much time as you need, so it would be good to get as much time
Oh, I mean, you've cut
as
me
I
off
need,
several times,
right?
but that's okay.
If the FDA, you know, the alcohol companies said that they were able to manufacture sanitizers when there was a shortage of sanitizers, and the FDA told them that they couldn't do it unless they put poison in it to stop people from drinking. And they said, well, we don't have the infrastructure to do that. And said, oh, well, then I guess you can't manufacture hand
Well, the
sanitizer,
alcohol companies
even though we're in the middle of a
manufactured sanitizer
shortage.
very soon at the beginning of the pandemic, so I'm not sure about that that particular
Okay,
story. But the broader question is, why is it that there had not been research into respiratory ailments going on a large scale from the pharmaceutical companies for years
I
before
don't understand how the pharmaceutical companies don't have an incentive to do that. They would be raking it in if
yes,
they'd done that.
they'll be raking in because this happened. But the question is, years ago, right? Are they
But
thinking, okay, there's like a 5% chance that this will happen?
who can
So,
predict every possible
so
eventuality?
you can't protect
Oh, if there's a 5%,
every
so why do you,
eventuality, but that's not the question. Look at the way that, for example, Pentagon funding works, right? Are they only building tanks as needed for wars that have already
are
started, or are they
there?
being asked to say, okay, here are a bunch of things that might happen. Of course, they're not going to cover every eventuality, but here are a lot of things that we're concerned with, and let's be prepared for all of those, because you can have that with public systems in a way that you can't with companies that are going to be very narrowly focused on what's going to happen to their stock in the near future.
I think if you could have that with public agencies, you would have had that. I mean, I don't really see why the government was better placed to predict this than the pharmaceutical industry was.
Oh, the
If
government's
I
a
knew
lot better
if I
place to
knew we were
predict
going
it.
to be
That's
debating,
not at
if
all
I
my
knew we were going
claim.
to be debating healthcare, I would have specifically designed my talking points for this
No, well, fair
conversation.
enough. I mean,
Um,
I didn't think so either. This is just kind of where it
yeah.
went. But the point is not that the
Um,
government better positioned to predict it
but
in
I
the
mean,
first place. The point is that anybody could have predicted it, but because we had pharmaceutical production largely in the hands of for-profit private companies, they didn't have an incentive to focus on that, because the incentive isn't, oh, hey, this could potentially be a big problem in a couple of years. The incentive is, what are we going to be able to sell a lot of this year? Whereas if you take it out
I'm
of the
not sure.
market, you have less of that incentive. I do also want to get a question for you that
I
somebody
think
asked
companies are
in Q&A.
constantly
Well,
making
finish
long-term
up on this
decisions.
first.
Sure, love. Yeah, let's go. Let's hear the question.
Okay, it's completely off topic, but it was asked a while ago, so I just want to make sure we don't lose it. So, do you want to finish what you were saying about this first?
Well, first of all, I just want to circle back. You said that the healthcare outcomes are better here. I don't think that's got anything to do with our health service. I think that's a lot to do with American lifestyles being a lot worse than they are. What we really need to be looking at
No,
is,
I've been to Scotland. I know what you have for breakfast there.
well, I don't. I'm a vegetarian, but I'm more than willing to grant that a lot of people's diet here are unhealthy too. I'm not sure we have as much of this corn syrup sugar that you guys seem to love over there, but
No, but
yeah,
I think when you compare the U.S. to Canada, I think that the lifestyle of Canadians is extremely similar to the lifestyle of Americans, and so you get similar kinds of disparities there, which is one of the reasons that I find that unconvincing. But
but
since I
given that we do have, right, given that most of the healthcare costs are going to treat illnesses that are preventable and are lifestyle related, what are we going to do about this? Like, I'm like, not, I don't just want to fucking talk about economics with you, excuse my language. It's like, I'm a mental health professional, right? I'm a therapist. I'm like, why is everyone fucking themselves up? You know, uh, why is the conversation not about, you know, what I know you're probably going to come back and say it's the capitalist system, stupid. That's why everyone's addicted to things.
I do not think
But
those two things are unrelated, but
okay. Like, but I mean,
I do hear what you're saying, and just because
that the conversation should be about that. But definitely, if you're, I, my fundamental point is we don't have healthcare systems, we have sick care systems. If I went to a financial advisor and he said to me, well, do you know what, Anthony? When your account's making money, I'll make less. And when it's losing money, I'll make more. Then I would actually expect my account to go down in value, not up in value. So basically, I think the way we think of healthcare needs to change and would potentially change on an actual free market, which is that you would contract with people to help keep you well. They get paid more when you were doing well rather than when you were doing sick. That's a discussion we can have maybe
no,
another time. But
that's entirely fair. I also
I'd,
before we get to the question from earlier, there's another question that came in that is well, okay, it's not really a question, but I'll read it anyway and let you react to it. Anthony Mark says, why is research for new broad spectrum antibiotics only performed by the government? Is because it's too unprofitable to justify the research despite the need for them, given the prevalence of extensively drug-resistant bacteria and fungi.
okay.
Okay, so since I think there's that literally at any point, I think that at any point we bring this up, we are going to be deep in the middle of what we were talking about. So at a certain point, we just have to do it. So the totally off-topic question that you have here, and although actually I'm just sort of fascinated to hear because I literally have no idea, is Jeremy Selman asks, what is Antony's take on Scottish independence?
Okay, that's fair enough. I get asked that a lot. Um, I guess it's an inevitability. I'm ambivalent about it. I guess, broadly speaking, I prefer smaller political units over bigger ones. Um, I feel both Scottish and British personally for what my personal sentiments are. I don't particularly, I do worry that I don't want them to turn this into the People's Republic of Scotland. I'm sure you'd feel quite at home there, but Scotland's a little bit more left-wing on economic issues uh, than England is. So I guess
You're convincing me to say Scotland.
I'm tentatively in favour of Scottish independence, but not strongly in favour. I'm also, I think, tentatively against it, but not strongly against it.
All right.
Depends what day you catch me on.
All right, that is entirely fair. Antony, I want you to come back in a few weeks, and we won't talk about healthcare every time because I know that we could have spent 10 hours on that.
Okay.
But
I've got a
there's
request for your audience, okay?
yeah,
On
go
my
for it.
YouTube channel, there is a video called Medicare for All, and I would ask you to go and check it out. It's only half an hour long. You can also listen to it on the Scottish Liberty podcast feed if you prefer to listen to it. Leave your YouTube comments. Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me I'm right. I don't care. But check it out. I tried to do some research for that one. I think you'll find it quite informative.
All right, fair enough. So actually, I think a really fun exercise, and I'm saying this not having watched the video yet myself. I will check it out. But you can watch Antony's video. You can read my article in Current Affairs called "The Many Bad Arguments Against Medicare for All." And if Antony makes arguments that aren't covered in that article, then those are probably ones that I haven't thought of. So if we ever do return to the subject of healthcare, those would be good ones to talk about. But I know that we have a lot of other subjects to cover. So if I can get you back in a few weeks, we'll move on to one of those.
Okay, great. Thanks very much for having me, Ben.
All right. Thank you so much, Antony.